He's just a useless husband, my wife said in open court. Not angrily, not emotionally, like she was reading a conclusion she'd already reached years ago. I stayed silent. The judge didn't respond right away. She looked past my wife and focused on her attorney instead. Her eyes narrowed not with anger, but with curiosity. Then she asked a question that cut through the room. "Counselor," she said, "are you certain you understand who Mr. Hartwell is and what he actually does?" My wife stiffened. Her attorney hesitated. And for the first time that morning, Lydia Hartwell's confidence cracked. The clock above the judge's bench read 9:14 a.m. when Lydia finished speaking. Courtroom 3B of the DuPage County Courthouse was smaller than people imagine when they think of court. No dramatic echo, no gallery packed with spectators, just worn wooden benches, fluorescent lighting, and the faint smell of paper and disinfectant that clings to government buildings no matter how often they're clean. I sat at the respondent's table with my hands folded, palms resting flat against the surface. I'd learned years ago that clenched fists invite interpretation. Still hands don't. My name is Ethan Cole Hartwell. I'm 52 years old. I've been married to Lydia for 26 years, and until 3 weeks before this hearing, no one had ever suggested out loud in writing or otherwise that I was incapable of managing my own life. Lydia stood a few feet away from me, angled toward the judge. Navy blazer, neutral makeup, the pearl necklace she wore whenever she wanted to look composed but sympathetic. She had practiced this version of herself carefully. I recognized it because I'd lived with it for decades. Her attorney, Trent Walden, had just finished outlining her petition. He described Lydia as a wife who had carried the financial and emotional responsibilities of the household for years. He described me as withdrawn, passive, and chronically disengaged from long-term planning. He emphasized concern, stability, protection. Then Lydia delivered the sentence she'd clearly saved for impact. "He's just a useless husband," she said. "He doesn't understand finances. He never has." She didn't look at me when she said it. I didn't react. Not because it didn't hurt, but because reacting would have served her narrative. Lydia had always believed silence meant emptiness. She mistook restraint for absence. That misunderstanding was the foundation of everything that followed. Judge Marlene Sykes leaned back slightly in her chair. She was in her mid-60s, silver hair, neatly cut reading glasses balanced low on her nose. She had the calm, economical presence of someone who had heard thousands of stories and learned how to spot the seams where they didn't quite hold. She didn't look at me. She looked at Trent. "Counselor," she said evenly, "are you confident that you understand Mr. Hartwell's professional background?" Trent blinked. "Yes, Your Honor. He works in operations. Risk management, I believe." The judge tilted her head, just a fraction. "And you're certain that's the full picture?" There was a pause, not long, but long enough for the room to notice. Lydia turned toward me then. Her expression tightened just slightly. She wasn't afraid yet, but something had shifted. I had not planned for this moment to arrive so early. I had expected to sit quietly through another hour of testimony before anything changed. But Judge Sykes had a habit, one I recognized from watching her preside over unrelated matters years earlier. When something didn't add up, she asked direct questions sooner rather than later. That habit was the reason I was there. 3 weeks earlier, Lydia had filed an emergency petition asking the court to appoint her as the temporary financial conservator over me. Not over my mother, over me. She claimed I was unable to recognize exploitation, unable to manage assets responsibly, and emotionally impaired by long-standing disengagement. Within 48 hours of that filing, my personal accounts were frozen pending review. My employer placed me on administrative leave out of caution. My access to certain internal systems was suspended. The word incompetent hadn't been spoken yet, but it hovered. I did not protest publicly. I did not accuse Lydia. I did not call family members to argue my case. I read. I've spent most of my adult life working in compliance and internal risk analysis. Not the flashy kind. I don't chase headlines or testify regularly in courtrooms. I support investigations. I review financial systems. I document inconsistencies and advise companies when something feels off. Occasionally, rarely, I've been asked to explain findings in legal proceedings. Quiet work, uncelebrated work. Work Lydia had always dismissed as paper shuffling. When my mother, June Cole, suffered a mild stroke 8 months earlier, Lydia had offered to handle the logistics. Appointments, accounts, documents. She said it would take pressure off me while I focused on caregiving. I let her. June trusted Lydia, or perhaps she trusted the marriage. Either way, papers were signed during periods of fatigue, accounts were accessed for convenience. Lydia became the point of contact for institutions that had once dealt directly with my mother. Then June died. 3 weeks after the funeral, Lydia's petition arrived. Sitting in that courtroom listening to my wife describe me as useless, I felt something unexpected, not anger, but clarity. Lydia wasn't improvising. This was a plan that required me to remain exactly who she believed I was, quiet, unobservant, disengaged. She didn't realize that silence had never meant I wasn't paying attention. Judge Sykes tapped her pen lightly against the bench. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, finally turning to me, "you've remained silent so far. Is that intentional?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" I met her gaze. "Because this petition depends on assumptions, and assumptions tend to collapse when facts are introduced too early." The courtroom stilled. Lydia inhaled sharply. Judge Sykes studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well," she said. "Ms. Mercer, you may proceed when ready." Dana Mercer, my attorney, rose slowly from her seat, and Lydia Hartwell, for the first time since filing that petition, looked uncertain. The first time Lydia called me useless, it wasn't in court. It was at our kitchen table years earlier on an evening that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and lemon cleaner. Ryan had just left for college. Hannah was still in high school. The house felt quieter than it ever had, like it was waiting for something we didn't know how to name. Lydia stood at the counter sorting mail, flipping envelopes with quick, irritated movements. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "So, what's your plan?" she asked. "For what I said." She sighed, sharp and theatrical. "For everything, Ethan. For your career. For us. You just float." I remember nodding. I remember saying nothing. At the time, I thought restraint was maturity. I thought silence kept arguments from becoming scars. What I didn't understand yet was that silence can be repurposed. Over time, Lydia turned it into evidence. Our marriage had always run on parallel tracks. We shared a house, raised children, coordinated schedules, but our inner lives rarely intersected. Lydia liked visibility. She thrived on being seen as competent, admired, indispensable. I liked systems. I liked order. I liked knowing that if something went wrong, I could trace it back to its source. She handled people, I handled processes. At least that's how it started. Gradually, Lydia took over anything that required a signature. She moved our savings to a different bank without telling me. She added herself as the primary contact on our insurance. She told the kids to ask her about money because Dad doesn't like dealing with that stuff. When I pushed back gently, she framed it as reluctance. "You hate responsibility," she'd say. "I'm helping you." And because I didn't want to fight, I let it go. The shift with my mother happened quietly. June had always been meticulous with her finances. She balanced her checkbook every Sunday morning with a cup of coffee, 2 sugars, a splash of milk. She kept receipts in labeled envelopes. She liked knowing where every dollar went. After my father died, she told me paper is memory. Don't lose it. When she started forgetting small things, I noticed before Lydia did. Or maybe Lydia noticed and didn't say anything. Either way, Lydia stepped in with confidence that felt reassuring at first. She scheduled appointments. She spoke to the bank. She told me she'd take care of the boring parts. "You already do enough," she said. "Let me handle this." June trusted her. Lydia was family. She was warm, attentive, capable. When Lydia brought documents to sign, June didn't question them. She was tired. She was recovering. She assumed good faith. I assumed it too. The first red flag came months later when Lydia mentioned casually that she'd been moving things around to simplify June's accounts. I asked what she meant. She waved it off. "Just housekeeping," she said. "You don't need to worry." But worry is a habit you don't unlearn easily. After June's funeral, the house filled with the usual rituals, casseroles, sympathy cards, conversations that never quite reached the point. Lydia took charge. She coordinated with the funeral home. She handled phone calls. She thanked people on my behalf. 3 weeks later, I received the petition. It arrived by courier, thick and official, addressed to me by my full name. I sat in my car in the driveway for several minutes before opening it, watching condensation beat on the windshield. When I finally read the words financial incapacity, emergency conservatorship, they felt surreal, like they belonged to someone else's life. Lydia was asking the court to appoint her as my temporary financial guardian. Not because I had made reckless decisions, not because I had lost money, but because, according to her, I was unable to recognize exploitation. The irony didn't escape me. Within days, my accounts were frozen pending review. My employer placed me on administrative leave out of an abundance of caution. No accusation, no explanation, just suspension. Years of steady work reduced to a waiting period. Ryan stopped returning my calls. Hannah sent a single text, "Mom says you need help." That night I slept on the couch. Lydia didn't ask me to. She didn't need to. The next morning I opened my laptop and started where I always did, with records. I didn't accuse Lydia. I didn't confront her. I didn't call family members to defend myself. I pulled bank statements. I requested transaction histories. I built a timeline. Patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves slowly if you're patient. It took most of the day before I noticed the alignment. Small withdrawals, consulting fees, transfers just under reporting thresholds, all clustered around specific dates. Dates Lydia had visited my mother alone. I highlighted them, cross-referenced them, built a spreadsheet. By the end of the week, I had identified multiple transactions, totaling tens of thousands of dollars, that did not correspond to any documented expense. When I asked Lydia about one of them carefully neutrally, she smiled. "Don't worry about it," she said. "I've got it under control." That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not betrayal. Recognition. Lydia didn't see herself as stealing. She saw herself as correcting an imbalance. She believed she deserved control because she believed she had carried us for years, and she believed truly that I would never notice. That belief was the most dangerous thing she carried into court, because silence, once mistaken for absence, becomes a liability. And Lydia had built her entire case on the assumption that I had none. I didn't go back to my mother's house right away. That surprised even me. For days after the petition arrived, I stayed in our home, moving through rooms that suddenly felt provisional. Lydia was careful during that time. Not kind careful. She spoke slowly, as if volume alone might trigger something fragile in me. She reminded me of appointments I didn't have. She offered to handle things I hadn't asked her to touch. She was building a record. So I waited. When I finally drove to June's house, it was a gray Thursday morning. The kind of Midwestern gray that flattens everything, makes colors recede. Oak Park was quiet, the neighborhood unchanged in ways that felt almost accusatory. Same brick ranches, same hedges trimmed just enough, same sidewalks my mother used to sweep every Saturday, like someone might be grading her. I parked in the driveway and sat there longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel. The house didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like a life paused mid-sentence. I let myself in. The air smelled like lavender and old books. June's smell. The living room was tidy but lived in. A throw blanket folded over the arm of the couch. A stack of library books on the side table. Her reading glasses upside down, exactly where she always left them. I went straight to the spare bedroom. June kept her records in a 4-drawer filing cabinet, beige and unremarkable. Utilities, medical, banking, taxes. She labeled everything in neat block letters. After my father died, she told me, "If something happens to me, you'll know where to look." I opened every drawer. At first, nothing looked wrong. Statements were there, correspondence, copies of checks. But after an hour, patterns began to fray. Envelopes resealed, statements out of sequence, gaps where originals should have been. I pulled everything onto the bed and started sorting by date. That was when I found the power of attorney. It wasn't hidden. It didn't need to be. It sat in a folder marked legal file neatly between older documents. June's signature was there. Real. Uneven in a way that matched the weeks after her stroke. The language was broad, too broad. It granted authority over financial decisions without meaningful limitation. But what caught my attention wasn't the scope. It was the timing. The document was signed on a day June's neurologist had noted increased confusion. Not incompetence, just vulnerability. Enough to make consent questionable, enough to make pressure effective. I photographed the document and kept searching. The journal came later. It was tucked between 2 photo albums in the hall closet, a brown leather notebook worn soft at the edges. The kind of thing you don't buy by accident. June had always liked objects that lasted. The first entry was dated 15 months before her death. Lydia called today, it read. Said she wanted to help more. Sounded sincere. I want to believe it. The entries were short at first. Dates, visits, Notes about fatigue, Lydia bringing groceries, Lydia asking questions about accounts. Then the tone shifted. Foggy day. Lydia had papers, said they were to help her talk to the bank. I signed, shouldn't have. Too tired to argue. 2 weeks later, better day, looked at papers. Power of attorney. I didn't mean to give that. Embarrassed. Don't want to trouble Ethan. My chest tightened. The last entry was addressed to me. If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I didn't forget who you are. I know what you do. I trusted you to see what I couldn't. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time. Not crying, just breathing. When I left the house, I took copies of everything. Originals stayed where they were. Evidence matters more when it hasn't been disturbed. That afternoon, I called Dana Mercer. Dana didn't react emotionally when I told her what I'd found. She asked questions, precise ones, dates, names, medical context. She listened the way investigators listen, without interrupting, without filling silence. This isn't about notary fraud, she said when I finished. It's about exploitation during vulnerability. That's worse, I said. Yes, she replied, which is why we have to be careful. She explained how these cases actually unfold. Adult Protective Services gets involved. Banks flag irregular activity. Courts look at capacity on a spectrum, not a binary. Lydia's petition wasn't just aggressive, it was risky. If the court believed June had been vulnerable, everything Lydia touched would be scrutinized. What do you want to do? Dana asked. I thought of the journal, of my mother's careful handwriting, of the way she'd protected herself without confrontation. I want the truth to surface on its own, I said, without me forcing it. Donna was quiet for a moment. Then we wait and we prepare. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived deliberately within Lydia's expectations. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse. I answered her attorney's questions minimally during the preliminary deposition. When asked about my work, I described it plainly. No embellishment, no credentials volunteered. Internal audit consultant, compliance support, risk analysis. Lydia watched the deposition via video link. I saw her relax as it progressed. She smiled when I answered simply. She nodded when I didn't explain myself. She mistook restraint for surrender. In the background, Dana worked. She requested bank records through proper channels. She coordinated with compliance officers who flagged transactions that didn't match stated purposes. She quietly alerted Adult Protective Services, triggering a parallel review. Not an accusation, an inquiry. By the time the hearing approached, multiple systems were moving independently. That was important. Truth carries more weight when it doesn't rely on one voice. The night before the hearing, I returned to June's house one last time. I didn't go inside. I sat in my car parked along the curb watching the porch light cast a familiar glow. I thought about how my mother had prepared for this without knowing exactly how it would unfold. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't accused. She had left a trail. In court the next morning when Lydia spoke and Trent repeated her narrative, I stayed silent. When Judge Sykes asked her question, when the room paused, I understood that we had reached the point my mother had anticipated. The point where quiet work begins to speak for itself. Courtroom 3B felt different after the judge's question. Not louder, not tense in the way people expect. It felt alert, as if the room itself had leaned forward, waiting to see which version of reality would hold. Judge Sykes didn't rush. She adjusted her glasses, glanced once at the case file in front of her, then looked directly at Dana Mercer. Miss Mercer, she said, you may proceed. Donna stood slowly. No dramatics, no pacing. She placed one hand on the table, grounding herself, and spoke in a tone that suggested she wasn't here to argue, only to clarify. Your Honor, Dana began, this petition is built on the assertion that Mr. Hartwell lacks the capacity to recognize financial exploitation. What we intend to show is that the opposite is true, and that the exploitation occurred because someone believed he wouldn't notice. She started with the bank records. Not all of them, just enough. A simple timeline appeared on the monitor. Dates on the left, transactions on the right, withdrawals, transfers, and payments labeled as administrative support and consulting. Nothing flashy, nothing obviously criminal on its own. These transactions, Dana said, pointing to the screen, occurred over a 10-month period. Each coincides with a visit by Ms. Hartwell to June Cole's residence. Not to medical appointments, not to banks, to the residence. Trent Walden rose halfway out of his seat. Objection. Overruled, Judge Sykes said calmly. Proceed. Dana didn't linger. Next, she said we address the power of attorney. She did not accuse Lydia of forging it. Instead, she framed it clinically. This document was executed on a date when Ms. Cole's neurologist documented increased confusion and reduced executive functioning, not incompetence, vulnerability. Judge Sykes leaned forward slightly. In Illinois, Dana continued capacity is not binary. Consent obtained during vulnerability, especially without independent counsel, requires scrutiny. Lydia crossed her arms tightly. Donna moved on. After execution of this document, Ms. Hartwell gained expanded access to Ms. Cole's accounts. That access coincides with a marked change in transaction behavior. She clicked to the next slide. Prior to this date, Ms. Cole's spending patterns were consistent for over a decade. Utilities, groceries, pharmacy. Afterward, we see discretionary withdrawals with no corresponding invoices, no medical billing, and no documentation supporting their stated purpose. Trent objected again. This time his voice lacked confidence. Judge Sykes overruled him without looking up. Dana paused. Your Honor, she said before proceeding further, I believe context is important. She turned slightly toward me. Mr. Hartwell, she said, can you explain briefly what your role has been professionally for the last 20 years? I stood. I work in internal compliance and risk analysis, I said. I help organizations identify irregular financial behavior and systemic weaknesses. Most of my work happens before anything becomes public. Have you testified in court? The judge asked. Yes, I said, a few times. When companies needed to explain findings, not frequently. Judge Sykes nodded. She turned back to Trent. Counselor, she said, was this background included in your assessment of Mr. Hartwell's capacity? Trent hesitated. We understood his role to be limited. That Judge Sykes replied evenly appears to be an assumption. Lydia stood abruptly. He doesn't like attention, she said sharply. He hides behind spreadsheets. That doesn't make him competent. Judge Sykes raised a hand. Ms. Hartwell, sit down. Lydia didn't argue, but her jaw tightened. Dana resumed. She did not introduce the journal yet. Instead, she presented a summary from Adult Protective Services, not a conclusion and inquiry. A PS had been notified. A preliminary review had begun. Banks had flagged irregularities independently. This court, Dana said, was asked to intervene because Ms. Hartwell claimed her husband could not recognize exploitation. Yet multiple institutions did so without his prompting. The judge's expression changed. Ms. Mercer, she said slowly, are you suggesting that this petition itself triggered a broader review? Yes, Your Honor. And that review is ongoing? Yes. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Judge Sykes folded her hands. Ms. Hartwell, she said, turning to Lydia, you requested emergency authority over your husband's finances. Based on what I've heard, that request appears premature. Lydia opened her mouth, then closed it. I am denying the petition, Judge Sykes continued, with prejudice. She paused. And given the evidence presented and the independent inquiries now underway, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for further review. The words landed softly, but they landed. Lydia's shoulders dropped, not in shame, but in calculation. She had lost control of the timeline. Judge Sykes looked at me again. Mr. Hartwell, she said you were right to remain silent. I nodded once. As the gavel struck, I felt no surge of triumph. Only a sense of alignment, like something that had been skewed was finally straightened. Outside the courtroom, Dana leaned toward me. This part is over, she said quietly. The next part won't be. I knew that. Because when systems begin to move, they rarely stop at the first truth they uncover. The courthouse doors closed behind us with a sound that felt final, but wasn't. Outside, the air carried the sharp edge of early spring, cold enough to keep people moving, not cold enough to excuse staying inside. Dana walked beside me toward the parking lot, her pace measured. The petition's denied, she said, but that's not the end of this. I know, I replied. What surprised me was how little relief I felt. The denial had lifted an immediate threat, but it hadn't restored anything Lydia had taken. Accounts were still under review. My employer was still cautious. My children were still caught between versions of the same story. And now the systems had noticed. Within 48 hours, the audit expanded. It didn't happen dramatically. There were no sirens, no confrontations. Banks simply did what banks are trained to do. When Adult Protective Services opens a preliminary inquiry, they widen the scope. June's accounts were examined alongside any joint accounts Lydia had access to. Transaction histories were requested going back years, not months. Patterns were compared across institutions. Dana called me that night. A PS is involved formally now, she said. They're not accusing, they're documenting. That matters. Does Lydia know, I asked. Not yet, Dana said, but she will. Lydia didn't come home that evening. Instead, she sent a text, short clip performative. We need to talk. You embarrassed me today. I didn't respond. The next morning, my phone rang before 8. Ryan. His voice was tight, controlled in the way people sound when they're trying not to choose sides. Mom says the judge overreacted, he said. She says you set this up. I leaned against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes. What do you think? A pause, long enough for me to hear traffic through the phone. I don't know, he admitted. She's always handled things. You've always stayed out of it. That's not the same as not paying attention, I said. He exhaled. Hannah's upset. She hasn't called, I said. She's scared, Ryan replied. Mom told her to stay out of it. That tightened something in my chest. Tell her she doesn't have to choose, I said. She just has to tell the truth to herself if no one else. Ryan didn't answer right away. Okay, he said finally. I'll tell her. We hung up and the house felt cavernous. Later that afternoon, Dana forwarded an email from a bank compliance officer. The tone was neutral, procedural. The content wasn't. Multiple transactions had been flagged as inconsistent with stated purposes. Several payments routed through a third-party consulting entity raised concerns due to lack of licensure and supporting documentation. A request for additional information had been sent to the account holder, Lydia. She'll panic, Dana said when I called her. That's when mistakes happen. I didn't want Lydia to panic. Panic makes people unpredictable. I wanted her to explain. Explanations leave trails. 2 days later, APS contacted me directly. A caseworker named Elaine Morris introduced herself over the phone. Her voice was calm, practiced. We're conducting a standard review related to June Cole's accounts, she said. We'll need to speak with you and your wife separately. Of course, I replied. Elaine asked about June's habits, her routines, her independence before the stroke. I answered carefully, truthfully. I didn't accuse Lydia. I described facts, dates, observations. Elaine took notes and thanked me. We'll be in touch, she said. Lydia came home that night late, carrying attention she didn't try to hide. They're questioning me, she snapped, dropping her purse on the table. Banks, some social worker. This is your fault. I looked at her. She looked smaller somehow, not diminished but compressed by the weight of scrutiny. This is the result of your petition, I said evenly. You asked for oversight. She scoffed. I asked to protect the family. By declaring me incompetent, I replied. Her eyes flashed. You are incompetent, Ethan. You don't understand how things work. I almost smiled, almost. Tell them that, I said. She stared at me, then turned away, jaw clenched. The next week stretched thin. APS interviewed Lydia. Banks requested clarifications. Dana coordinated with investigators, careful not to interfere. My employer extended my administrative leave, citing ongoing external review. No promises, no timelines. Ryan visited once briefly. He sat on the edge of the couch and avoided my eyes. She won't answer questions directly, he said quietly. Mom, she keeps saying people are twisting things. Do you believe her, I asked. He hesitated. I don't know what to believe. That's honest, I said. Hannah called 2 nights later. Her voice shook. Dad, I think I messed up. You didn't, I said immediately. Whatever it is. She told me she'd seen Lydia wearing June's earrings months earlier. Family jewelry. Lydia had said June gave them to her. Hannah hadn't questioned it at the time. Now she wasn't sure. I didn't tell anyone, Hannah said. I was afraid Mom would be mad. You can tell APS, I said gently. You don't have to accuse, just say what you saw. She sniffed. Will it ruin everything? I thought about June's journal, about quiet preparation. No, I said, it clarifies things. The audit findings came in pieces, not all at once. Each piece aligned with the next. Transfers routed through a third party, payments justified vaguely, documentation created after the fact. Then Dana called me one evening, her voice lower than usual. They identified the intermediary, she said. A woman named Janelle Pierce, not licensed, not bonded. She's been contacted by investigators. Did she respond, I asked. Yes, Dana said, carefully, with counsel. That mattered. It meant Janelle wasn't acting impulsively. It meant this would unfold the way real cases do, slowly, deliberately, with consequences measured in months, not moments. Dana paused. Ethan, she said, be prepared. This will take time. Relationships won't snap back. Some things won't return to what they were. I looked around the kitchen, the same table where Lydia had once called me useless. The same quiet corners where assumptions had hardened into truth. I'm not looking for everything to go back, I said. I'm looking for things to be honest. That's usually harder, Dana replied. When I hung up, I sat alone with that thought. Honesty doesn't rush. It accumulates. And once it does, it doesn't disappear just because someone wants it to. The call from Dana came on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that pretends to be ordinary until you answer it. They've contacted Janelle Pierce formally, she said. With counsel present, she hasn't confessed to anything, but she's cooperating. I sat at the dining table, my laptop closed, the house quiet, in that way it had learned to be. What does that mean exactly? It means she's answering narrowly, Dana replied. Providing records when compelled. No speeches, no texts. This is how people protect themselves when they realize the ground has shifted. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. That was consistent with everything I'd seen so far. People who think they're in control improvise. People who know they're exposed follow procedures. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation expanded in small, methodical steps. A PS completed its initial assessment and referred the matter to the county. Bank compliance units issued follow-up requests. Subpoenas were drafted, not dramatic, just precise. Every request pulled another thread. Lydia tried to regain control by appearing cooperative. She attended interviews. She answered emails promptly. She framed every transfer as a misunderstanding, every payment as administrative necessity. She leaned heavily on the idea that June had wanted things handled quietly and that I had never taken an interest. Investigators listened. Then they compared notes. The pattern didn't change. What changed was Lydia's tone. She stopped calling me incompetent and started calling me manipulative. She told Ryan I was weaponizing my job. She told Hannah I was letting outsiders tear the family apart. Each version contradicted the last. Each conversation left more residue. Ryan withdrew. He didn't defend her anymore, but he didn't confront her either. When he visited, he spoke in fragments, questions without conclusions. I let him. Loyalty isn't something you pull apart quickly without doing damage. Hannah, on the other hand, started talking. Not all at once, not easily. She described moments she hadn't thought mattered, her mother asking her to run errands, to the bank instructions, to keep conversations vague, reminders to stay out of grown-up stuff. None of it was incriminating on its own. Together it sketched intent. Dana cautioned me not to draw conclusions aloud. Let them assemble the picture, she said. Your job is to remain consistent. That consistency mattered when the district attorney's office finally reached out. Assistant State's Attorney Renee Alvarez requested a meeting. No accusations, just a conversation. Dan and I met her in a modest conference room downtown. Renee didn't waste time. We're looking at potential charges related to financial exploitation of an elderly adult, she said. Possibly fraud, possibly forgery, depending on how certain documents were used. I asked the only question that mattered. What happens next? Evidence review, she replied. Witness cooperation. If charges are filed, we'll offer a plea. If not accepted, we proceed. She looked at me carefully. This won't be quick. I'm not in a hurry, I said. That night, Lydia finally confronted me directly. She waited until the house was quiet, until the children were gone, until it felt safe to control the narrative again. You did this, she said, standing across from me in the living room. You could have stopped this at any point. I looked at her, not angrily, not defensively. I didn't start it, I said, and I can't stop what I didn't create. She laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. You always hide behind that. Procedure, systems. You act like you're above this. I'm not above it, I replied. I'm inside it. Her expression shifted then, not to fear exactly, but to calculation. They won't put me in prison, she said. Not for this. I didn't answer. 2 weeks later, Lydia was charged. The indictment listed counts under Illinois law related to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and fraudulent documentation. Not the maximum charges, not the minimum. Enough to anchor the case. She was not arrested in a dramatic sweep. She was notified through counsel and surrendered voluntarily. The process was procedural, predictable, public record, but not spectacle. Trent Walden withdrew as her attorney the following day. The plea negotiations took months. Lydia rejected the first offer, then the second. She insisted on explanations that contradicted the evidence. She blamed stress. She blamed marriage. She blamed me. Finally, the paper trail closed the remaining exits. The transfers, the intermediary, the timing, the power of attorney executed during documented vulnerability, the absence of independent counsel for June, the inconsistencies Lydia could no longer reconcile. She accepted a plea to a Class 2 felony. The sentence reflected what these cases often do when the numbers are significant, but the defendant has no prior convictions: a suspended prison sentence, 3 years contingent on compliance, 5 years of probation, full restitution with interest, mandatory financial disclosure, and a permanent prohibition from acting as a fiduciary or managing another person's assets. To satisfy restitution, Lydia was required to liquidate assets. The house went on the market. Not ours, hers. A property she'd purchased quietly the year before under the name of a trust she could no longer justify. I wasn't present when the judge accepted the plea. Dana was. She called me afterward. "It's done," she said. I sat at the kitchen table and let that settle. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like weight redistribution, like something heavy had finally been placed where it belonged. The consequences extended outward. My employer reinstated me, but not immediately. There was a probationary period, additional disclosures, quiet monitoring, no punishment, just caution. I accepted it. Some systems forgive slowly. Ryan took longer. He oscillated between anger and grief, not always sure which belonged where. We talked. We didn't resolve everything. That wasn't the point. Healing, I'd learned, doesn't follow verdicts. Hannah began therapy, then asked if I'd come with her to a session. I did. Lydia sent a letter through her attorney months later. Shorter this time. Still no apology. Just regret shaped like self-defense. I didn't respond. Some conversations don't require closure. They require distance. One evening after the house had quieted again, I opened June's journal and read the last entry once more. If you're reading this, she'd written, it means you didn't look away. I closed the book. The systems had spoken. Now it was my turn to live with what they'd said. The first time I woke up and realized the case was truly over, nothing felt different. No rush of relief, no sense of triumph, just quiet. It was early before 6. The house was still the kind of stillness that used to make me uneasy. I lay there listening to it, realizing that for the first time in over a year, the quiet didn't feel like something waiting to be broken. The plea had been entered 3 weeks earlier. The paperwork finalized. Restitution schedules approved. Probation terms set. Lydia was no longer fighting, not because she had accepted responsibility, but because there were no moves left that didn't make things worse. Justice, when it comes, rarely announces itself. It settles in like weather. The financial consequences were slower. Lawyers had to be paid. Audits had costs. Even with restitution, ordered money doesn't return all at once. I sold my mother's house in Oak Park in late autumn. Not because I wanted to, but because it made sense. Because holding on to it would have meant clinging to something that had already served its purpose. On the last day before closing, I walked through the empty rooms one final time. The house echoed, not with ghosts, just with absence. I stood in the kitchen where June had once balanced her checkbook every Sunday morning, 2 sugars in her coffee, a small notebook always open beside her. I took the journal from my bag and placed it on the counter. I didn't look away, I said quietly, not to anyone in particular. Then I closed the door. Work resumed gradually. My employer reinstated me with conditions: additional oversight, periodic disclosures, a quiet reminder that trust once shaken takes time to rebuild, even when you're not the one who caused the fracture. I accepted that without resentment. Systems don't run on emotion, they run on consistency. And I knew how to be consistent. Ryan didn't come around right away. Months passed where our conversations stayed careful, almost scripted. He was polite. He asked about work. He avoided talking about his mother. I didn't push. Loyalty doesn't vanish just because facts arrive. It has to unwind on its own. The turning point came unexpectedly. He called one evening and asked if I still had June's old recipe box. I found something, he said. He came over that weekend and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. A bank notice, dated years earlier, addressed to June, forwarded to Lydia's email. I found it in Mom's old files, Ryan said quietly. She never mentioned it. I don't know why. I looked at him, at the way his hands shook just slightly as he held the paper. It's okay, I said. You don't have to fix this. I know, he replied. I just needed you to know. I see it now. That was enough. Hannah's healing looked different. Therapy helped. Distance helped. She didn't excuse Lydia, but she didn't sever herself completely either. She learned slowly that loving someone doesn't require defending their choices. Watching her learn that taught me something too. Lydia never apologized. She complied. She attended mandated sessions. She paid restitution. She followed probation terms. But remorse, real remorse, requires looking inward, and Lydia had spent too long outsourcing that work. I stopped expecting it. Months later, I received one final letter. Not from Lydia, but from the court clerk. Confirmation that restitution had been completed, that June's estate was officially closed. That chapter sealed. I sat at the kitchen table that evening with nothing spread out in front of me. No documents, no timelines, no spreadsheets. Just a cup of coffee and the quiet I'd once mistaken for emptiness. I thought about the word useless. How easily it had been said. How confidently it had been believed. Silence doesn't mean ignorance. Calm doesn't mean weakness. And being underestimated is only dangerous if you believe it too. Lydia thought my quiet made me invisible. She thought my restraint meant disengagement. She thought paper was something you could rearrange without consequence. She forgot that paper remembers. If you're still here, thank you for listening, for staying with this story through its uncomfortable parts. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or quietly erased by someone who thought you wouldn't notice, I'd like to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what time it is there. These stories don't exist in isolation. They live in the spaces we recognize ourselves. And if you want to keep walking through stories like this, stories about dignity and the long arc of quiet justice, subscribe. There are more ahead, and I'd be honored to share them with you.